The 1960s decade was a decade of many life-changing events for Americans in history. One of the most influential people of the 1960s was John F. Kennedy Jr., who was inaugurated as the 35th president on January 20th, 1961. During his president, he done a lot of great things that are still memorable, including he signed the executive order establishing the Peace Corps on March 1st, 1961. He was involved with the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961. On May 11th, 1961, he authorized the deployment of 400 Special Forces troops to Vietnam. May 25th, 1961, he committed to space exploration. He established Navy SEALs January 1st, 1962. He was involved in the Cuban Missile Crisis October the 16th through the 28th. He signed the Fair Housing legislation November 20th, 1962. He expressed his support for civil rights in June of 1963 in a televised address. He amended the Intellectual Disabilities Amendment, the Intellectual Disabilities Act, with an amendment on October 24th, 1963. But I think what he was most famous for, what most people remember him for, was his assassination on November 27th, 1963. President Kennedy and his staff, wife included, left on Air Force One for Texas at 10:05 a.m. on November 21st, 1963. He stopped in Fort Worth to give a speech to the League of United American Citizens, in Houston, to the League of United American Citizens in Houston. He then traveled to Fort Worth, Texas, where he gave his last speech 9:25 a.m. November 22nd, 1963. He traveled on to Dallas, where he was greeting crowds at Love Field, when his staff was they didn't want him to do this, didn't think it was a good idea. He then left with his staff in a motorcade from the Love Field, passing through streets in Dallas, where over 150,000 people were lining the streets. It was during this traveling in the motorcade that President Kennedy and Governor Connally were shot at 12:30 p.m. on November 22nd, 1963. At 1 p.m., Parkland Hospital doctors pronounced President Kennedy dead. At 1:30 p.m., the newswire services announced the death of John F. Kennedy. Another person that's very influential in the 60s, and some people may say is more influential, is Martin Luther King Jr. Martin Luther King Jr. was involved in the March on Washington, where 250,000 people were marching for jobs and freedom, 100 years after the Emancipation was signed. Marshals were placed throughout the crowd during that event in case unrest broke out, but it turned out to be a peaceful demonstration, and there was no trouble. During this time, Martin Luther King was supposed to speak, and so it's an interesting fact that he ended up being the last speaker because none of the other speakers wanted to speak last because they were afraid the news media would leave the event before their speech. So he agreed to go last, and he agreed to keep his speech to only 4 minutes. His initial speech had nothing to do with the I Have a Dream speech, but Mahalia Jackson stood up in the crowd and said, "Martin Luther, tell them about your dream." So he paused, he stopped his other speech he was doing, and that's when his I Have a Dream speech was spoke. And as everyone knows, it's still very popular and influential in our lives today. And his speech ended up being 16 minutes long that day. The speech is believed by historians to bring about the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Act of 1965. One of the other things he's also remembered for is his assassination. On April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee, where he was going to give a speech to sanitation workers on strike. He was killed at the Lorraine Motel while standing on the second balcony. He was 39 years old. Rioting happened in more than 100 cities across the United States. April the 11th, President Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1968. He has remained the most widely known African American leader of his era, according to History.com. And another influential and life-changing event of the 60s was, of course, the Vietnam War. In 1945, according to History.com, there was the first American casualty. Apparently, fighting had been happening in Vietnam since the 40s, and in 1945, we had a first American casualty. 1951, November 1st, is considered the official involvement by the United States. That's when President Eisenhower sent military advisory groups to Vietnam to help train their troops. In November 1961, to help train Vietnam troops, John F. Kennedy, as I've said before, sent in 400 of our soldiers. In October, there were 200,000 U.S. troops sent to Vietnam. On December the 22nd of that year, there was a first troop casualty, which for many people, according to History.com, was the start of the Vietnam War. In 1966, after more than a year in Vietnam, there were then 389,000 troops in Vietnam. 6,000 had been killed, 30,000 wounded. In 1967, the troop number reached 485,000. In 1970, there were 420,000 troops still in Vietnam. The last troops to leave Vietnam was on March 29, 1973, although some military advisors and Marines did stay behind. More than 3 million Americans helped with the Vietnam War in some way. Of that number, 1,000 were declared missing in action, 150,000 were wounded, and up to 60,000 people died. So, in conclusion, the 1960s were a time of ever-changing events. Today, we have all been impacted by the death of John F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King, and we have so many family members that have been affected by the Vietnam War. Some still say there are prisoners of war in Vietnam. I think for me, the most of the three that affects us still today is Martin Luther King Jr. Without him, I don't think there would have been the civil rights movements that there were, and I don't think that Black Americans would have the freedoms that they do today. Thank you.